So welcome to the March 13th edition of the virtual seminar series. We have a great paper today. It's going to be presented by Adam Soliman, also co-authored by Steve Billings, Institutional Investors and the Erosion of Homeownership. So just some logistics before we get going. The chat room should be open to everybody, so you can post questions in there. I believe Steve will be monitoring that and trying to field those questions as they come up. And also you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. You can unmute yourself, I think, once you're a panelist. Yeah, you should be able to unmute yourself and you can ask your question. That shouldn't be a problem. So any questions before we get started? Adam, you good to go?
Yeah, ready to go, yeah.
Okay, so we have 60 minutes of presentation, 15 minutes of questions, but that will kind of be mixed up with questions throughout. So an hour and 15 minutes in total. Great, take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Lindsay. So yeah, today we'll be talking about the role of investors in homeownership. But before we get into the meat of the paper, just let me motivate why we thought this project was so important and interesting. So just kind of some background. Most of everyone in this audience would know that wealth creation often is coming through homeownership in the US, but we've been seeing these kind of two concerning trends. The first is that the wealth gap between Black and white Americans continues to grow. And the second, which is a little bit more core to our paper, is the fact that homeownership rates have really stalled since the Great Recession and actually worsened for Black households. And that's what these two figures are showing you here. So these kind of baseline differences between homeownership between Black and white households, but the fact that after the Great Recession, really we're seeing that difference continue to grow. So it's kind of a puzzle, and one of the things that we think is important is this unexplored driver of corporate landlords or these large institutional investors in the real estate market. And why do we think that since the Great Recession there was this perfect storm for entry of these investors into the real estate market? The first is that there just was a really large supply of single family homes. And during the same time, we're seeing this tightened credit access for individual home buyers. And combine that with this decrease in overhead costs, and we're really seeing a large entry of these firms into it. And so what is their strategy, though, right? So that's the kind of the perfect storm. And what are they doing when they're trying to enter in? These are quite important for kind of thinking about what our results are later. So I'm just going to take my time here. So first is the fact that it's generally cash offers. So these large investors are offering cash to these home buyers, relatively quick closings, oftentimes with very little contingencies. And this last part, I think, is the most important aspect, is the fact that they're converting these homes into long-term rentals, right? So they're kind of taking away the homeownership aspect and bringing in longer-term renters. And why that might be the case is they really are using these REITs, right? So this idea that they package together a bunch of different rental properties and have this long-term kind of stream of income to generate cash. And this is just one of many headlines that I think a lot of people have been seeing, is just that these firms are really becoming landlords in this space, right? All right. So before getting into it, I think maybe some people have some feelings on even just the word corporate landlords might sound like it has some negative connotation to it, but the reality is there could be some pros and cons. So let me go over the pros of having this increase in investor activity in the real estate market. The first is that they're just increasing demand for existing homes, right? You're having a new entrant. This might bid up, the price of homes and provide liquidity for those homeowners. I think this last point is kind of interesting if you're thinking of, let's say, the moving to opportunity literature. So if you imagine that there's some amenities in a given community that has mostly been accessible just to single family homeowners, now by having this rental in this space, you might be allowing them to have access to better schools or something along these lines. The potential cons here is because they are paying cash, they're oftentimes discounting it slightly by no home repairs and just keeping it really. So we agreed that these chats will be sorted out later, right, Lindsay? Is that, or
Yes.
should I be? Yeah.
I mean,
right.
Steve, did you want to take this in the chat, or do you want to?
I just want to make sure that just not okay, perfect. So potential cons could be the fact that they're paying less for these houses because they're quick sales or limited home repairs, and thus it's lowering the value of other properties nearby. I think there's a lot of sense that corporate structure might mean that they're minimizing costs, so maybe not taking care of the property, minimizing in terms of repairs. And this last one is kind of I wouldn't say necessarily a NIMBYism thing, but the fact that they're changing the composition of the neighborhood. So by bringing in renters, we know that there might be some differences between renters and buyers, and so there might be some negative social spillovers associated with this homeownership loss. And you can see here, that's kind of what the New York Times might be suggesting, right? That they're really coming in a large way, buying up tons of properties, converting them to rentals, and really boxing some people out and potentially changing the composition of the neighborhood. So we want to kind of test this, but first, high level, we're trying to just understand the scale of this activity, right? So the first part of the project will be somewhat descriptive in nature. So understand the scale and dynamics of their purchasing behavior and what that means for, home prices by race. And then we're going to transition into some causal estimates of kind of the localized impacts of this activity. So what happens when an institutional investor buys a property, what happens nearby, and are we seeing any of these spillovers, both in terms of prices and in terms of non-price outcomes, let's say like these criminal activity, political engagement. So specifically, what are we doing here? We're going to identify all institutional investors in North Carolina. This is a non-trivial task just because if you think of the corporate structure, they're usually kind of trying to obfuscate who is actually owning the property. So this kind of, I think this will be useful for this audience to see later, but I'll get into more details. Next, we're going to bring together a lot of different administrative data. The idea being is that we really not only want to know the price impacts of the purchases, but also what's happening to other outcomes we might be concerned about. And so just to kind of match it with the literature, we're going to first start off with estimating these neighborhood larger price impacts and see how they evolve when investors enter in. But this is going to kind of capture two effects here, both the larger market effect that I was kind of mentioning before and these local spillovers. And so I think really the thing that's going to be interesting for this audience is that we're going to use a very granular spatial difference in differences estimator. This figure on the right here, I'll just take a second because I think it will help frame the results exactly what we're doing. So imagine this kind of blue circle right here in the middle is that institutional investor, that transacted home that was bought by an institutional investor. And all these other green dots are homes nearby that transacted at different years relative to that investor property. And so the way we're going to be thinking about treatment and control is at really tight levels. So imagine that this red circle is maybe 500 feet from the purchase, and then our control area would be, let's say, 500 to 1,000. I mean, we're going to make that much more concrete, but the idea is we want to see what happens to homes that are transacted nearby, before and after, relative to further away. And this is going to be not only with prices, but we're going to see, because we've geocoded all of the other outcomes, we can see how these things evolve. And the idea being here, we're kind of netting out any sort of larger market effects, and we're really focusing on these localized spillovers.
Sorry, Adam, the before and after here is before and after there is any kind of institutional investors purchasing any units, or?
Yeah, so these will all be single family homes. And so you can imagine, let's say this is from real data. So this house right here in teal was bought by an institutional investor in 2016. And so we have some units that were transacted before then and some that were transacted after, and you'll see them kind of in event study plots. Is that what you meant, Luis?
So what I'm thinking is you're discretizing here, the purchase of one home. What I'm thinking about is what happens if
multiple
the whole block is bought by institutional investors. Do you do,
yeah, so we vary the size a lot.
Rings or
so we vary the size a lot to try to ensure both that we're getting like communities close enough. So there's relatively little overlap when you kind of make these such a small thing. So they're not buying an entire block frequently in our sample. So that's maybe 10 or 15% of the time. Otherwise, we're able to have this kind of minimal overlap where this is exactly what it would look like. So you have in a single institutional investor and then this kind of behavior. But we'll show you a bunch of different ways to go about it. This is more to give intuition of how localized we're talking here. So like I said, this is like within a few hundred feet.
And then the ones in the outside ring would not belong to any other outside rings.
Exactly. That's another one of the considerations that we want to make sure that there's minimal overlap, both of like not many institutional investors, but we're going to test that out and I'll show you it, but simultaneously that we don't have treated units that will be controlled units in the other one. Exactly. Perfect. Now, thanks, Luis. All right. So what do we find descriptively? First, just to give a kind of overall, 7% of all single family homes in Mecklenburg County, where we're going to be focusing on, were purchased by investors. If we focus in on just neighborhoods that were ever targeted by these firms, that almost doubles to 17%. So right, this is relatively large activity in this space. Just an interesting descriptive statistic is that almost 80% of these transactions are occurring in above median Black census block groups. Now, I'm going to show you that they are having a little bit of a discount. So remember, I was telling you that why might they be discounting it? Because it's all cash, relatively quick closings, and we're seeing that on average, they're about 4% cheaper than similar homes. And I think this last fact is quite interesting and potentially unfortunate, is that the fact that the decline in homeownership over this time is about 2%. And if we focus in just on Black neighborhoods, that's 4%. I'm relatively new to the urban space, but this didn't seem like a very large number until you find out that this is actually mirroring the exact same homeownership loss that occurred during the Great Recession. So this is a relatively big deal, right? So now, what are the causal impacts? So Luis kind of already was asking a question about our estimation strategy. So we're going to do kind of two separate things. First, because we have a panel of every single home when it's transacted and not, we want to see what happens both to the individual property and then what happens in this ring design. So first, what we're seeing is about 80% of the time, we're seeing an increase in the probability that a home becomes non-owner occupied, essentially meaning that it's a renter, but then it remains. So we're seeing that this persists. So this is kind of our first pass to make sure that all that descriptive kind of anecdotal evidence or stuff that you read in newspapers is actually happening, that they're buying these homes in cash and potentially converting them to rentals. We're seeing that kind of behavior. Now that that's the case, we want to see, all right, well, what happens to nearby properties after that home gets converted? Remember that usually in this literature, we're thinking of gaining homeownership. Here, we're seeing this kind of loss of homeownership. And so as a first pass, we're going to see these dynamic decreases in nearby housing prices. So to what we were saying before, this is something like within a few hundred feet of the institutional investor purchase relative to just a few hundred feet outside of it. And so we're seeing this kind of relative price decline of about 1 to 2%. Interestingly, this is almost exclusively in Black neighborhoods. So this effect is only persistent, or only we see it there. Now, this is kind of, like I said, we're thinking of price outcomes, but also non-price outcomes. So remember that they're buying these homes, converting them into rental properties. We're seeing this, decrease in prices. And why might that be happening? So what we seem to find is that there are these negative social spillovers associated with this large loss of homeownership. And so using the exact same design that I was showing you before in that beautiful figure, we're seeing increases in crime across the board. So property, violent, and drug crime. We're seeing increase in nuisance code violations. So this would be things like noise complaints or something along these lines. We're seeing a decrease in building permits. This is kind of a maintenance aspect. And let me just step back for a second. I meant to preface this a little bit more. So remember that there are essentially two things that are happening here. You're seeing both a conversion of a property that used to be owned by a homeowner, and you're seeing this corporate landlord aspect. So you're seeing a renter come in and you're seeing this aspect of a corporate landlord. What we're trying to capture with these different non-price outcomes is to get a sense of which might be happening, and it might be tough to disentangle the two. But if you think of an increase in property or crime across the board, maybe that's more of a rental story, right? And maybe same with nuisance code violations, leaving stuff on your lawn. That's maybe more of who's moving in. But this decrease in building permits is suggesting that there's also something that's happening on the corporate landlord side. We're going to try to disentangle this a little bit more throughout the paper, but it is something to be thinking about, that there are potentially two changes happening here. Now, this last outcome is political participation. We know that generally when you're owning a home, you might be participating in PTO or local governance, this kind of stuff we were talking about before the presentation. Here we're seeing a decrease in political participation, which is, again, I think more of a rental story. All right. So how does this relate to the literature? So I kind of signaled before that there is this large literature starting with Ed Glazer and, oh, sorry, yeah.
We do have a question. Andra, go ahead.
Good morning.
there.
So I'm trying to think of how to square your results with the fact that, these are mostly going to be foreclosed homes that were at risk of foreclosure or were in the foreclosure process, right? So
Not
these
necessarily, actually, but go
not,
ahead.
not necessarily, but these are like distressed homes, and these were disproportionately, we know that the foreclosure crisis disproportionately affected African American neighborhoods, right? That it was disproportionately. So, I mean, the fall in the home ownership at the aggregate level, I guess my prior was that was largely that this was unsustainable home ownership for a lot of people in this community. And so I guess I'm trying to have understand how you square like what properties were available for institutional purchase. The other question I have is this paper by Carlos Garriga. I don't know if he's on the call, but the way I read this paper, it was basically Athena Sidoro is the other author on that paper, and they may have a third, but I read that paper as like they basically put a floor because they had the lower cost of capital. They had cash when nobody else had a cash. They sort of put a floor on these foreclosure prices that otherwise they would have just been like at 50% of regular value, and instead they were at 70%. So how do you sort of reconcile that, I guess? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, no, and I think your point, Andra, about your prior coming in that these are foreclosed properties, that's probably what I would have thought too. Actually, we find that that's not the case at all. So they're actually going after above average quality homes. I'm going to show you some descriptives in a bit about what do they target and what they don't. I'm just going to say generally that they're not doing that. So part of the strategy is kind of what I was front ending, where they buy the property and want a renter to be in there as soon as possible because they package it up in these REITs and then kind of resell it. So if these are depressed properties, that usually will involve some sort of investment to make it up, and that's not worthwhile for them. So actually, we're finding that they are going after good homes actually, and not foreclosed properties. So that the kind of do you mind if I defer on the rest? But does that make sense as a first pass?
Yeah. So we're just quickly tell me what's your SIP period?
2011 to 2020.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. But no, but it's a fair point, right? And I think that is what, like I said, my prior would have been coming in, but we find actually the opposite, right? Okay. So actually perfect timing, the related literature. So Andre, your point will be number 2 in a second. But so for the first, we find that this relates to the social benefits of homeownership. We're generally seeing, from Ed Glazer and these kind of papers that there are tons of benefits from having it and these kind of social spillovers. We're really looking at the opposite phenomenon. So I think that that's kind of an interesting angle where it's these large scale conversions to rentals as opposed to, let's say, rent to buy. I'm in London now. There's a big strategy. Do you have another question, Andrew, or is that hand from before?
It is another question. Okay. You're not looking at build for rent communities. That's my other question.
No. These are single family homes. Yeah, everything's
well,
single.
But build for rent is single. Those are single family homes, right?
Yes. No. Yeah, those come up a little bit later and are in a different part of the city. But yes, no, we're not looking at that.
I guess
looking at
there you're adding supply very directly, right? And it's a different type of supply than we saw. And again, my strong prior, you can disabuse me of it, but that build for rent adds very, very valuable family-sized housing stock that wouldn't have otherwise. But I'll defer.
Yeah. No, but we're not looking at that. So we're looking at a fixed stock that kind of had been built at the beginning of our sample period, and we're ignoring kind of the outskirts, but that might be for a future paper. Fair point, though. So for the second contribution, kind of what we were just talking about, the fact is that these foreclosed properties are not the same as the properties that they are targeting. And this last one is kind of more directly on investors and prices and work in this space. We're going to be really focusing a lot on localized spillovers, individual properties, as opposed to kind of overall market effects. We'll talk about that a little bit, but I think our contribution is much more at a localized level. So just, for the sake of kind of perspective, this is something that both local communities and kind of larger state governments are caring about. So, you have this aptly named Stop Wall Street Landlords Act of 2022, this kind of limiting tax benefit because they're seeing potentially these firms as being predatory. That's kind of at a larger scale. But I think the stuff when we were talking to people in Charlotte that is quite interesting is things like homeowners associations. So potentially having a role of limiting these negative spillovers, whether right or wrong. The idea is maybe they might do something like say, hey, if you're going to buy in this community, you have to wait a year before you can rent it. But those are just kind of, I think our paper might help with giving some more causal estimates on that in that space. But I think, another room might be that there is still space for these tax incentives for promoting homeownership. So this is what the outline is going to look like. We'll talk a little bit about the data and provide some descriptives, a little bit of background. We'll kind of split up the analysis into looking at what happens to the property that is bought. And then the focus of really the paper is looking at this spatial diff and diff design. And then we'll conclude. So I was telling you before that like a first pass thing that was quite important for us to do was to identify what homes were actually purchased by an institutional investor. And so I was telling you before that they're oftentimes trying to obfuscate ownership. So this is actually a snapshot of the data that we got from Charlotte Mecklenburg. These are our parcel information. And so you can see here, this is what the raw owner would look like to us if you were just kind of looking straight at this data, right? So these are all single family homes. They're telling you the value here and sale date. And this is what it would look like. And through a bunch of different channels, which I'll tell you about, we basically find that all of these owners are coming from the exact same institutional investor. And these are just kind of their different subsidiaries, basically. And so they use these subsidiaries to buy the properties, probably for a variety of reasons. But this is kind of our first pass contribution, is figuring out ways of bringing together a bunch of different data sets to go from something messy like this to the fact that it's all the same large scale institutional investor. All right. And then, as I was saying earlier, Tandra, we're going to be focusing on the post-Great Recession, so 2011 to 2020. And this is kind of the main data sets that we're going to be using. So that snapshot that I showed you is coming from the tax assessor. Not only is it going to give us, information on owners and prices, but also a bunch of information on property attributes. This is going to be able for us to tie together what is predicting investor purchases. We're going to bring together a bunch of different crime data, which is going to be geocoded, so we can do it with a bunch of different spatial designs. Similarly with building permits and code violation data. So we're going to focus first. Let me just kind of break this up because I think it's important. These nuisance code violations are an important outcome. And so these are going to include things like junk cars on the lawn, trash in the lawn, or just a general accumulation of trash. But it's not going to be on building construction violations. This building permit is another source of data. This is going to be thinking about like structural stuff that's changing to the home. And so this is kind of my point of what I was saying earlier. This might be a better measure of kind of rental activity composition changes. And this is going to be a little bit more along the lines of something to do with the investor, the corporate landlord. And then the last thing we have is a bunch of voter data. And this is going to just be brought all together as our best measure of participation in the community. All right, so this is kind of looking, so prior to 2011, we observed that there were no institutional investors. That number of 21 people in the chat, that seems like there must be some great activity in there. So 2011 is when we really see the entry of institutional investors, and you're seeing that really it's dominated amongst these 6 firms until 2020. So we sometimes remove 2021, sometimes keep it, but you can see that it's really these six firms are I think it's about 75% of all institutional investor activity is driven by them. This is just kind of giving you a spatial distribution of what's happening year in, year out. So this is the yearly share of purchases that are from a institutional investor. And so you can see that it's kind of concentrated outside the fund. So this is Charlotte Mecklenburg. This is kind of the city center. And so they're really in these kind of suburban neighborhoods. But you can see that this one is basically saying that in 2014, 100% of the purchases were made by institutional investors. But these are at the census block group. This is kind of just showing you the breakdown. This is just purely descriptive. It's, I'm not claiming that they're targeting Black neighborhoods necessarily. This could be due to how, gentrification might have pushed certain people to the outer ring. But what you're seeing here is that for census blocks, a lot of these are being purchased in above median Black share of census blocks, and similarly census block groups. All right, and so this is kind of speaking to something that Andra was curious about. I can show you the full table, but we first just wanted to get a sense of what predicts an institutional investor purchase. So we're going to regress whether it was an institutional investor purchase or not on a bunch of different attributes and kind of census geographies, but everything is going to be relative to the oldest, lowest, or worst. And what I mean by that is we wanted to see, relative to the oldest homes, what happens when we look at different decades. So here, what we're seeing is they're really going after homes built in 1990s and 2000. So it's a strong positive association that institutional investors are going after these kind of homes built in that time. They're also going after like starter home size. So between 1000 and 2000, that's relative to 0 to 1000. I think this to me was one of the more interesting ones. This is kind of breaking that foreclosure thing that we were talking about earlier, but they really are going after average or above average quality homes, which I think is quite interesting. This percent black and census block, it's something that Steve and I have been thinking a lot about, and we'll kind of show you a few different things later, but it's a strong predictor. And then there's a negative predictor. So everything has been positively associated with the institutional investor purchase, except for homeowners associations. And this is what I was kind of telling you a little bit about before. These might be one of those local governance structures that might be able to limit through local ordinances or they're related to limit investors from coming in.
Question from Jeff.
Yep. Hey, Jeff.
So when you talk to these institutional investors, right, what's their strategy here? Why do they pick the homes that they pick? They obviously think they're going to make money on the homes that they choose versus the ones they don't choose. The other thing is, I would like to see something about price trends here, right? Are they going into neighborhoods that have been seeing declining prices or rising prices? And obviously, it's not random where they're picking homes. And I'm sure that you will do your best to account for that non-random choice. But certainly, I would want to know about what's been happening with prices before this. And it would be interesting to know what their strategy is. Why, what is their decision-making process in terms of why they choose the homes that they choose?
It's a fair point. I mean, so they're a mix of publicly traded and privately traded firms. So, getting in touch with them, we haven't spoken to them. That's kind of to answer your first point. But I mean, from everything that we've seen from newspaper articles, it's kind of what I was telling you before. We know that their strategy is to convert to single family homes to rental properties. But to your point, yeah, I mean, we can do a little bit more about what's happening to those neighborhoods. But part of what I want to say is kind of what I was signaling before, is that I think when you look at a larger area, let's say like a census tract or something like this, you'd be concerned that there are like market trends and potentially these social spillovers. So one of the things, Jeff, that we'll be doing is really going in very locally where the comparison point is not necessarily like over. Your point of maybe non-randomness is fair, but the randomness that we're going to be exploiting is the fact that this property versus this, this is subject to availability in any given year. And so the fact that this property is treated and this one is control is just kind of, I'll talk to you a little bit more about our assumptions in a bit, but you're right that maybe there is some sort of selection there. We don't find that necessarily to be the case, but I think our estimation strategy gets around potentially some sort of targeting that they might be doing, which we don't seem that they are. It seems to be somewhat.
But you're going to show me there's no you're going to test for pre-trends.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, but I was just kind of giving you more like a philosophical answer. But yes, I mean, yeah, we find that we don't find any pre-trends in any way we cut it up. So, perfect. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, sure. And I think
Adam, just another quick question. Do you see any differentiation between the types of institutional investors? Because I know they tend to employ algorithms, like literal algorithms.
Yeah. It's fascinating, their business structure. Yeah, so we haven't been able to yet. I mean, any way we cut it up, like, one way of doing it was just, there are 6 main ones and we can estimate it separately. We're finding that they're relatively similar regardless of how we cut it up. But it is one thing that I think we want to go a little bit further into, is like, even maybe the public versus private might be something that's important, or something, but at the moment we haven't found a good way to do that. But yeah, I'm open to it. But it does seem as if kind of uniformly we also thought like large versus small, right? Like 75% of them. I'll show you some of that, but no, not at the moment. But
Okay.
Cool. And so this is. Oh, did I cut you off? Or Lindsay, did you have another? No. Okay. So the next thing, these are the strong predictors of what they purchase. And then we wanted to see what does that mean for prices. So basically, this is just a comparison of average real prices for our sample window and kind of our sample construction. And basically see massive discount. But then as we start conditioning on other things that we might feel are important, even here when we condition on property attributes and neighborhood attributes, we're seeing that there's a significant decline or a discount in what investors pay for homes. So they are, but this is kind of fitting with what they do is, cash offers, quick sale, relatively little questions on kind of fixing anything up about the house. So it's just kind of, they pay less on average. All right, so just kind of to speak to Jeff's point, and just even to fit more broadly within the literature, this is more of a motivational thing. This is not our core results. This is more for us to get a sense of what's happening at this larger geographic unit than we're actually going to be studying. And so we want to motivate our very spatial, granular diff and diff estimation with something just what's happening when more institutional investor purchases happen in a community. What does that do to prices? And so we're going to think of cumulative purchases in a few different ways. So let me just kind of mention what the control groups are, and then we can talk a little bit about it. So Jeff, I'm hoping that this will also answer some of your questions, but just kind of interesting motivation. So one thing that we're going to do is look at census blocks and census block groups. For the census blocks, one control group we're going to use is blocks that are without an institutional investor purchase, but that are in the same census block group where an institutional investor has been in. So trying to get a little bit more into apples and apples. But another one is just to be throwing out any census block that didn't have a purchase and just rely on the timing of it. So that's kind of two control groups. And we're going to do something similar at the census block group level, which are just a little bit larger, but the intuition is somewhat similar. I think the one thing that I want to point out that we see as not necessarily a flaw with this but it's compounding two different effects. So it's the market effect, right? So just by having something about these neighborhoods and some cumulative aspect there, but it's also going to have some local spillovers that might be happening from the loss of homeownership. Basically, I think the main takeaway here is that regardless of what way we consider a control group, we're always seeing declines in prices as you're seeing more institutional investors. And so now we want to kind of separate out the fact that this might be some sort of market trend or market effect from social spillovers, and that's really what we're going to spend the rest of the paper on. Okay. So first, we're going to motivate with some what's happening at the individual property level. So what you should be thinking about here is just these are parcel level information, and we're going to be looking at within parcel changes. And this is just going to help us get a sense of what might be happening. So this is kind of standard event study for an individual purchase. And this is kind of that main thing that I was telling you about before. So this is looking at within the property, what happens at the time of the institutional investor in terms of owner occupation. So what we're seeing here is a very large drop and a persistent drop in owner occupation. And so the idea is if you imagine that this is some sort of flipping story, then these should kind of return up, right? If it's just kind of renting for a short period of time and then they, resell it, then you would see an owner come back in. And so we're not seeing that. And, we have about 10 or 11 years of sample data. So, this is our preferred window, but in this, we're not seeing that reversal, right? So I think this is for kind of like a first stage effect. You should think of this. So are we seeing that when they buy it, a renter comes in? To some extent, this kind of confirms that thought. Next, these are just a bunch of other outcomes. They're a little bit noisier because we're matching based on, not perfect geometries, but this is kind of overall, you're seeing this kind of decline in voting at that property, and that kind of persists over time. You're seeing this kind of dynamic decline in building permits. And again, this kind of short-lived but increase in nuisance codes. So remember, this is kind of like the individual property might be disengaging from the political process. This is kind of what this is suggesting. Here, this might be maybe a maintenance story, right? So it's not being upkept. This is more like structural things you should be thinking about with building permits. And this nuisance code violation, Steve and I sometimes joke that this might be some sort of Karen effect, but, nuisance codes are usually, someone calls in. And so you're seeing this kind of sharp increase and it goes down. It's an interesting thing that could be a variety of reasons, but this is just kind of what's happening there.
Question from Jeff.
So I see a pre-trend in building permits, right? A negative trend. I see. So it looks like they're they're going into potentially neighborhoods that are seeing a decline in building. And it just continues there. That trend continues.
Yeah, it's
Should
a
I be
fair
worried
point.
about that?
I wouldn't be worried about it, but maybe maybe you would be. But yeah, I mean, these things aren't matched perfectly. Like, so this is kind of why this to me is the one that we're most confident about. But no, it's a fair point, Jeff. No, I wouldn't. Possibly it's spurious. You can see that also it gets really noisy here, and yeah, a fair point. But no,
It doesn't look spurious to me. I draw a line and it goes down.
no. I'm saying like
Pretty
the fact
clearly.
that this kind of
Yeah.
it gets much noisier. No. It's a fair point. Yeah, I mean there potentially could be a little of trend here. I'm going to show you a bunch of other tests that I think I'm more confident in the conclusion with. This is kind of a little bit more broad strokes, but fair point, Jeff. All right. So now I think this is kind of the heart of the project that I wanted to get into is what is happening at this kind of localized social spillover level. So here we're saying that a property J is purchased by an institutional investor. These other black dots are transacted properties. And the fact that one property might be in the white relative to the yellow, these are kind of our two identifying assumptions. So the first pass thing is that this is coming from Pat Bayer's work that home buyers can select properties based on neighborhoods and some sort of home attributes, but not the exact location. That's just kind of due to some idiosyncratic nature of availability. So maybe one year this is available, another one this one, and this is kind of what we're relying on. So that's kind of the first pass. And then individuals will sell properties to the best offer regardless of who is actually buying. So this is kind of our two main identifying assumptions. And this is kind of the formal math of it. So near being a dummy variable, institutional investor being a dummy variable, and this is kind of our event study coefficients. Okay.
Adam, how big are these rings?
So our preferred specification is going to be 500 feet. So this will be 500 feet and to the boundary, and then another 500 feet there. But if you I mean, we're going to do a donut design. We're going to vary these things. We're going to estimate them non-parametrically. Part of why the 500 feet to us is ideal because it minimizes overlap. This is kind of the thing that you were talking about, so that there's not another institutional investor property here. But it's small enough that it's kind of we can be happy that things are kind of similar in terms of the market effects, but large enough that it's still capturing enough properties, basically.
And then you're also, are you observing, is this data the census block? Because like some of the conclusions you stated at the beginning were about the census block groups, or is that the level of geography you see, or you can actually identify the individual?
Oh, yeah. No, so nothing at this point is anything to do with census geographies. This is all us taking a property and building a ring around
You know
it. Some of
exactly
that's
where it is. Okay.
know exactly where it is. That's if we want to bring in like race of the neighborhood or something. We have to rely on the fact that, the census block is the smallest. But like part of why I wanted to motivate things with that like more markety effect thing, the census block analysis was to give kind of credence to the fact that they're actually end up being not too far off. But no, this has nothing to do with census geography. This is all us mapping exactly where these are.
Okay.
Another question from Jeff.
So you showed us the picture where there's incredible spatial correlation in where they're buying these houses.
Yeah. At the census
so-
block group. Yeah. Mhm.
Yes, so I'd be concerned about these pictures you're drawing because it's most likely that there are other investor purchases nearby.
Well,
Right,
I mean,
given how spatially correlated they are.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've checked for that, but clearly
Yeah.
that's a problem here because of how spatially correlated these purchases are, right? And
Yeah.
so you're going to tell me you've cleansed this completely of any other kind of, already treated problems or whatever that are going on here. But that's a little bit surprising given how spatially correlated they are. But
No, I hear you. And so the spatial correlation that you were seeing was at the census block group level, which are quite large, right? And the way that we're designing these rings are to try to minimize any sort of overlap. But to your point, I think that's the way that maybe you're thinking about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a little bit more of a market story. Our point is it doesn't like we're controlling for the market here, right? Like we're gonna have, distance band by geography, fixed effects, and all those things to get to that. But But I think the fundamental thing that I'm trying to say is we're not necessarily caring about the spatial concentration, because the way that we're designing is the transacted homes that we're going to be baking into, like that we're going to be focusing on, is this property relative to this property, right? So this might be, 100 feet difference. And so the treated aspect is based on, really, really small geography. Does that kind of help, Jeff, or does that not?
It does, but it doesn't, it means you could be picking up some other estimate that some of these have already been treated. So you're comparing two houses that in some sense have already been affected by nearby institutional investors. And you may get a difference, but it's conditional upon, what's happened prior to that. And which could be quite different than what you're conveying to us. Just and maybe you've cleansed the data perfectly for all that, but that's
No, it's a fair concern. So just to make sure that we're on the same page, you're saying that potentially there's a ring like this that would overlap it in some way, and so that this unit is treated in one and a control in another, or the fact that overall there are potentially
that there's rings that overlap, spatially and temporally. There's also temporal issues because these are dynamic effects. So this could have happened a while, a year or so ago in the past or whatever, but.
So I can speak to the overlap thing. The reason why we choose 500 feet is to ensure that there's minimal overlap, so that we don't have that kind of issue. So that's to the first one. The other, let me just show you the event studies, and then I'll show you a bunch of different ways that we try to address that point. Sound good? Okay.
It sounds more than good.
Thank you. It's tough not to, I see a smiling face in your picture, but I don't know how you're actually feeling. So I'll take it as you're smiling behind it as well. So here we are. There. Thank you. Keep it this way from now on, please. So what we're seeing here is, remember that this is going to be our preferred specification, but we do donut designs where it's, let's say, 0 to 200 feet relative to 500 to 1,000. We're going to vary these rings in a bunch of different ways, and the estimates are always around 1 to 2% declines. So we're doing a bunch of different estimators here, but remember that the control is going to be from 500 feet to 1,000 feet from the institutional investor purchase relative to the 0 to 500 treated. And so this is kind of that dynamic decrease that I was mentioning before. All right. And so, Jeff, to your point, later, one of the things that we wanted to see is another outcome could be investor properties, right? So as opposed to just seeing, let's say, prices in this area, we're going to do all of our non-price outcomes. And I'm going to show you that they can't target in such a way. And I think part of it is due to this first assumption, right? Like that you can get a neighborhood broadly, but you can't pinpoint a specific home. And so really, we're just going to be comparing the fact that you might be on one side of the border or not, due to the kind of idiosyncratic nature of availability.
But to be clear, it's not one side. It's just not exactly one side. It's in one ring versus the other ring.
100%. But I guess my point is,
you kind of give us this point that you're comparing neighborhoods just right across the border, which is not the case. You're comparing one ring to the other ring.
Yeah, we're seeing the social spillovers of investor purchases, right? Yeah, or the loss of homeownership. All righty. So we're going to take this event study, and then we want to look at average effects based on a few different observable things about larger scale neighborhoods. So if you kind of average out what you just saw in this event study, you're seeing about a 1% decline in prices overall. And then what every single breakdown here, so 2 to 3, these are all splitting up the sample. So these two things will always add up to 157,000. So I told you before that effect really seems to be happening in Black neighborhoods. We don't really see any differences on HOAs versus not. I thought density might matter, right? In areas that are maybe more dense, you would see kind of a different price. But the one thing that really does seem to be happening here is that this is kind of happening in newer purchases. And this could be due to a few different things. And we're in the moment trying to figure that out. But it could be that, previous literature usually is focusing on this part of the sample. It could be a cumulative story, but remember, we're trying to net those things out. But yeah, this is the reality of our price results at the moment, that this really seems to be concentrated in Black neighborhoods and kind of our newer purchases. All right, and then this is kind of to help us think a little bit about spatial decay. So this idea is here, this is 0 to 500 relative to 500 to 1,000. We're going to keep that same control group, so 500 to 1,000 feet from the institutional investor purchase, and then we want to see what happens closer and just a little bit further away. And so to us, you're going to see that, you know, the effects are pretty much uniformly stronger closer to the purchase relative to just a little bit further away. And remember, keeping the same control group in both circumstances. This to us is kind of saying that there is something specifically that's happening right nearby. And so, yeah, this is so it's kind of the overarching takeaway from here is that there really is spatial decay for this effect. Jeff, how are you feeling about this?
I would believe it if you told me that those are statistically different. There's some spatial decay, but I want to know that they're actually different statistically rather than I just look at them and one's smaller than the other.
All right, fair enough.
And
I'll
could
add that
be.
to the next one. I cut you off. No, please go ahead. Okay, cool. All right. All right. So this is kind of our main falsification tests. So, you know, obviously there's always concerns about what might be driving the results. And so I'm going to walk you through these two different things. So on the left, what we're going to do is we're going to take the actual institutional investor purchase and we're going to randomize that year of sale from 2011 to 2022. So let's say that it happened to be in 2015 that it was purchased. We're going to randomly assign it a year. And then we're going to run that difference in difference regression 1,000 times using a new sample every single time. And what you're observing here is the distribution of the t-statistics. Our observed t-statistic is all the way over here, suggesting that it's not, you know, sparse, or it's not due to chance. This right one, I think, is kind of an interesting one because Steve and I were a little bit concerned. Is this just like something that's happening over time and these are just properties that are being purchased? So what we do in the second one is we remove all the institutional investor purchases, and then we're going to take a sample of non-institutional investor transactions. So just transactions that were bought by, you know, families or something along these lines. And then we're going to treat them kind of as pseudo investor properties and run that same specification. So, you know, basically taking this J as opposed to it being a real investor purchase, it's a pseudo investor purchase. And then we're going to do that, you know, 25 times. We're going to randomize which ones gets assigned that institutional investor nominator or nomiker or whatever the right word is. And then we're going to repeat that process 25 times. And you're going to see that, you know, it's a small and insignificant price effect.
And you choose these so that they're very close by to where the institutional transactions occurred?
Yep, excellent question. Yeah, so what we do is we take it, we look only at census block groups, so the relatively larger unit of geography, but they have to have at least one institutional investor purchase in that larger area. So we're kind of, you remember how you were talking about that spatial concentration aspect? So we're removing any place that was white in that figure and just focusing on ones that are there. And this to us, I think, maybe I should have brought this up when you asked this question earlier, but this to us was like a nice test for that, basically. All right. Sounds good. All right. So now remember that I was telling you before that there are these kind of two elements to our results potentially, right? So you have the corporate landlord and this kind of larger scale investor, and then you're having the fact that there's a renter moving in. And so what we wanted to try to do was approximate, see, can we remove the corporate landlord aspect? So these are our main estimates here. So all institutional investors, just the larger ones. And so you're kind of seeing that. And then we wanted to define basically like a local flipper or like a local investor. So basically someone that has, you know, less than 10 properties, but more than one. And basically what we're seeing is just running the same specification that, yeah, there is a slight price decline, but we're not seeing anything significant. We were hoping to see some more movement here. You know, I think eventually we're trying to purchase some rental data and have a better sense. But I think what this captures, there's still a large number of observations of these. So it's not like a sample size issue, but I think part of it is just suggesting that local flippers might have a very different function, right? So we know that these corporate landlords are really trying to buy a lot of homes and convert them to rental properties. You know, local investors might be wanting to do something from flip it in a few years, or just they might have fundamentally a different way of going about business. So to be determined if we can kind of suss this out a little bit better, but. All right, so in the kind of final 10 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on to non-price outcomes. So this is going to be estimated the exact same way. So that same kind of ring design that I was showing you before, just with different outcomes. So here, this is kind of, you're seeing the magnitude increases that we would anticipate. Sorry, for all of these outcomes, it's per parcel or per 1,000 parcels. So what you're seeing here is a relatively modest, but significant increase in all types of crime, right? Decrease in building permits. This is the one that's kind of more structural maintenance stuff, and an increase in nuisance codes. I think, Jeff, since I am still seeing your face, I'm going to show some additional results here that we thought are kind of interesting. So owner occupied, this is just kind of seeing what's happening to like a broader level. Are we seeing movement away from owner occupation? I think 2 was the one that for me was the most critical one, because we were concerned about potentially, they buy one and then they can get right back into that. And this is suggesting not only is that not happening, but it's so small and insignificant, right? This is likely mechanical, right? Because of how the transacted properties are working more broadly. Okay. So so I think these are kind of our non-price outcomes, the social spillovers of the loss of homeownership. And then this is our political participation measures. And so we're really seeing that existing voters are moving out. This is kind of, I think, fitting with the fact that you used to have homeowners and now you're having renters. I think it's kind of interesting seeing an increase in the share Republican. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that's the case, but to be determined later. So again, this is fitting in just to kind of overview it. We're seeing those increases in crime, and we're seeing decreases in political participation and increases in nuisance code violations. That does seem to suggest kind of more of a rental story. All right.
Oh, sorry. There's got one question.
Oh, sure.
Nat?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. One of the things that I'm a little stuck on right now is this is the impact on the people and the residents of these communities who live there before the purchases going forward. One of the things this is sort of running into in my head is all of the literature about land use regulations and HOA rules and all sorts of other policy mechanisms that are in a lot of ways designed to keep renters out of neighborhoods, and those are frequently criticized. How do you sort of square this kind of these sorts of findings with with that literature, with the potentially beneficial impact this could have on the renters of these investor-owned properties? Is it what you alluded to earlier, sort of the difference between the institutional versus the non-institutional? So if I guess first, how do you think of that? And second, and sort of related, I'm surprised there's not much of an observable difference between the different kinds of institutions, the different firms that are doing this, because they have very different strategies. One of the things I wondered if you looked at was Home Partners of America, which is an institutional investor, but they have a lease to own strategy. So you would expect that there would be a substantial difference there, and I believe they're active in Charlotte. So just curious what you thought about both of those.
Yeah, so let me start at the back end. So looking at different investors, I think that's like where we're trying to go in next and just like reading a lot more about strategy, and can we figure out more of those things? Because at the moment, what I had done was just kind of split up the sample by that, but it ends up being kind of like a sample size issue because it's unclear what the best control groups are. So we're definitely going to be addressing that. I wouldn't take the fact that I said at the moment we haven't seen any difference as like concrete. We're going to dive much deeper into that. And so but I do want to answer your first question, but would you mind just summarizing it for me one more time, please?
Yeah, basically, issue is you're finding these basically negative effects to the current residents of the community that might, argue for a policy to keep renters out of the community, not just institutional purchases, just renters, because that's part of the effect that you argue. That has a history in the country how do you sort of square that with your results?
No, that's a fair point. And so it's kind of a two-part thing. So first you were kind of bringing up this aspect of like HOAs. So let me explain it in that way. So we do find that these investors are generally not buying homes in HOAs, and part of that could be because they have some sort of element to protect the communities, not just the fact of renters not coming
A
in,
lot
but
of them prohibit, rentals at all,
1,000%.
and some of them prohibit over a certain percentage. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And we were seeing that in Charlotte, and this is kind of happening in 2022, so after our sample period, but a lot of them are saying you must wait a year before you can rent it out. So that's kind of seems to be a common one in this area, but it's after our sample period. But now to your point, I think, at the moment, you're right that there is a component of a renter story, but there seemingly also is a corporate landlord story. And this is kind of just looking here in front of us at column 4, this could be a maintenance issue, right? So something like maybe not taking care of the roof or something structural about the building. And remember that these are relative effects, right? So it's something that's happening, within 500 feet relative to 500 to 1,000. I think, the way that I think of this is, that there's a lot of literature seeing the social benefits of homeownership. And because this is the reverse process, that partly could be it, right? So you're seeing disengagement from the political process. You're potentially seeing more crime. We don't know, like one of the next steps, and I was just about to show you on the conclusion, is we want to get a lot more information on the renters that are moving in, because at the moment it's unclear what is driving it specifically, right? Like we're seeing, these increases in crime, increases in nuisance codes. We know that likely ties together to property prices, right? That might be the mechanism there. But then kind of one layer deeper, is this something that is changing about the community? It's in relatively disrepair, closer to the property relative to farther away. Is it actually the people that are moving in there? To be determined, but I hope that I answered it kind of to the best that I can at the moment, but I'm happy to follow up, or we still have a few minutes.
Oh, another question
Sure.
from Yong Chang.
How does the effect compare with, let's say, an individual investor buys the property and
You cut out there at the end. I just heard individual
out?
property. Could you say that one more time? I don't know if it's my internet or yours, but one more time.
Oh, you're muted.
Is it just me, or I didn't hear what he said?
Here, let me see if I can.
He's muted.
Yeah,
Okay. I didn't mute him. I'm happy.
Yeah, so,
there we
so
go.
can anybody hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now. All right, go ahead. Yep.
So how does the effect compare with like if an individual investor buys a property and rent it out?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of what we were trying to do here, right? Like, so, these are large institutional investors, right? This orange and green coefficient here. And these are what we define as local flippers in two ways, right? Like, so someone that's owning less than 10 properties, but more than one, and using something from the Charlotte assessor data to tax assessor data to do it. We're seeing kind of a wide range in what happens. So we don't have a precise estimate when a local investor is purchasing, but yeah, of
Thanks.
course. All right, so I had just finished with here. Is that a new hand or is that a different hand? Shall I?
I think that's an old hand.
Okay. He looked young, but all right, so let's conclude here. So, big picture, we're seeing homeownership rates decline on par with the Great Recession. And with this kind of loss of homeownership, we're seeing this dynamic decrease in housing prices. We try to understand what might be driving them, and we find these kind of larger, commonly hypothesized effects that relate to the loss of homeownership and these social spillovers. So increases in crime, decreases in maintenance, increases in nuisance code violations, things of this nature. And I think what we really want to first order is kind of, a few people have brought it up today, something on the firms is something that they're doing that might be making it one way or the other. I think we really want to understand the renter aspect, right? So the nearby area is potentially having some negative spillovers, but understanding what's happening to the person that moved in, I think would be very helpful. And also with understanding our results more, who is moving in, both race, income, things of this nature. And then I think, this is kind of a larger part of our research agenda is to understand, again, what does that mean for these communities in terms of educational attainment, criminal justice contact for people that are nearby, things of this nature. So I'm gonna end it there because I think we're just on time, but I wanted to leave it open for Q&A.
Great, so I'll
Steve,
open it up to Q&A. Thanks so much, Adam. That was excellent. But before I open it up, I just want to do some promotion for our next meeting on March 27th. We'll have Luliu presenting mortgage lock-in, mobility, and labor reallocation. So if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
sure. So I'll start with Dogan, I guess.
Yes, thank you. This is quite timely. I have a question that is different from what you covered. Institutional investors have the opportunity to invest not just in housing. They can invest their capital anywhere they wish to.
Yeah.
Why is it that they are now moving into the home ownership area? In the past, they did not. Is this an unintended consequence of the 2008 crisis where interest rates have been reduced to zero, to negative, and they have a lot of capital and they do not find anywhere else to put their money in? If that is the case, when the interest rates move sufficiently higher and things can change, and then do you think they are going to move out of the housing markets? And then, the story will be rewritten all over again.
Thanks for your question. I think, I can speak more to like what we believe is the perfect storm, right? So you remember after the recession, you're right, like the recession plays an important role, large supply of single family homes, tightened credit access for individual home buyers, and then you have this kind of decrease in overhead costs. So, Lindsay was bringing up this, these algorithms that are able to buy many houses, but there's also on like the property maintenance side, right? You have some sort of aspect where they can interact. So I can speak more to the fact that, there was this opportunity, and remember that a lot of people got burned from the submortgage crime, crisis. I think I spoke for a lot of time. I'm losing my marbles. But here we're seeing kind of another avenue in which they can have these permanent streams of income. So I think that speaks to why they might have done it, but I can't speak to much more than that. Simon, or I'm sorry, Albert, I think you were there first.
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very interesting paper. I have a couple of comments. The first one, it's really on foreclosures and to what degree investors are really just following foreclosures. I mean, I don't disagree. It's a treatment and you have a control that's relatively good, but it might be that you're just like looking at the impact of foreclosure if the probability that the property is bought by an investor correlates with foreclosures. It's just a proxy for foreclosures. So I'd like you to look at that and see whether, because we do know that there's negative spillovers and externalities from foreclosures. The second
if I just say something about that real
please,
quick?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we were showing at the earlier thing of like what predicts an institutional investor purchase, and we find that they're average or above average quality homes. So they're not going after foreclosed properties unless you mean that other homes foreclose because of it, but in general we're not seeing that they're buying foreclosed properties.
Okay, the second no, thank you for that. The second comment is really more on the pitching, on how you pitch this, and I appreciate if you're careful because there's three pitches. The first one is the one that you seem to take, which is the evil investors.
I never said
the wealth of minorities.
Yeah, all right.
The second pitch would be investors facilitate local affordability. And the third pitch is having renters, which are mostly poor people, is detrimental to home values. Obviously, the three things might be construed as true from your research. So I appreciate if you're very neutral as to the findings and sort of not to load this too much on one direction or the other. But thank you very much for that.
No, I appreciate it, Albert. And actually, we are in the middle of kind of trying to think of how to pitch this. So yeah, I mean, that suggestion is fair, and we're gonna be thinking a little bit harder about that. But because it is recorded, I would never say anyone is evil. So thank you. Jeff, you were waiting for a little bit. You just need to unmute yourself if you want.
Let Simon go. I've asked a bunch of questions. I'll go after him.
All right, thanks. All right, Simon.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Adam, for this lovely presentation.
course.
So we know today with the high interest rates, it's actually the opposite happening. You know, these institutional investors are selling more homes than actually buying. There was a big Wall Street Journal article about that. So I just wondering, how do you see your results? Are they symmetric in a way? If we're seeing the opposite, is the opposite going to happen, or why yes or why no? I know you're not covering this period, but that was just would be interesting on your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think already some of my priors have been shaken by this research in a good way. I would be concerned with kind of saying yet. I mean, we're still accumulating more data, and I think, you know, we could test it out, but I can say that our results are somewhat symmetric with the social benefits of homeownership literature, right? Like, so in the fact that they find those positive social benefits, we're seeing the reverse. It's unclear. I don't know, because it could be that the local community has already been triggered and is fundamentally changed. So even if they sell, I think it's unclear, but it's a great question, and we'll definitely, you know, continue to analyze this. And our period, yeah, does end in 2020, but if that's kind of a new reality. If anything, though, it was Simon, I think, that was answering. I was seeing that the scale has only increased in their purchases, but maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe it's kind of something in the share as opposed to the actual stock, but great question.
Yeah, like money-wise, they're selling more than buying.
That is
Like, yeah.
cool. All right, I'll take a look. Jeff, do you want to go? Or?
Sure. So I think, you know, you showed your event study, and the dynamics is really important. You see this decline, and, you know, what you give us the single, you know, average point estimates, those are averages. And in fact, it may, you know, in the end, the decline may be even greater in terms of prices. If you know, and so I think it's important to emphasize that dynamic, because I think it goes along with your story that there's this kind of continuing decline in neighborhood quality. You can also do those same kind of dynamics with your other variables like crime. Is it the case that you know, you're seeing increased crime over time and your other factors as well? Look for the same dynamics to help, you know, explain and provide more evidence for your story that this is you know, declining quality or whatever over time. And you know, is there an increase in transactions? Are you seeing kind of this, you know, this flight away as people, oh, I think the neighborhood's, you know, turning over and I'm going to move out? Do you see, you know, those kind of effects as well? Would be interesting. And you also showed, I think, that there was a decline in minority. I guess this is residential people living in the area.
Voting. It was voting. Yep. It was from the
Oh,
voting
no,
record.
but there was a the minority. It was voting by minority. I see.
Which
The
is
other
tough
thing is,
because there could be. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yep.
I would love to know why they're targeting Black neighborhoods. Right?
Yes.
Why Black? What is it about Black neighborhoods that seems to attract them? And then you may have to talk to them. And I don't know if they'll own up to that, but it's, you know, this is a question: is why are they targeting Black neighborhoods per se? What is it about those neighborhoods that they find appealing in terms of, you know, obviously they think they're more profitable?
Yeah, so the neutral stance would be in Charlotte specifically that due to gentrification and kind of the how urban dynamics changed in the 70s and 80s, they kind of purchased homes on the outer ring, and those happen to be starter homes, right? Like in the 1,000 to 2,000 square foot thing. There could be maybe something more malicious, and I think to your point, that's very fair. Like to think of, you know, all this stuff on the returns, or you know, how when different races sell homes or buy homes, how they get the returns. But at the moment in Charlotte specifically, and we're going to be expanding this to the rest of the US and have a better sense of it, it does seem to be that this is a feature of just the reality of kind of how Black people have moved over time in Charlotte, as opposed to a malicious thing. But a fair point. We do look at the dynamics. They do match our price for the non-price outcomes. But I think, yeah, there's a few things in there, and I'm glad that this is being recorded because there's been a lot of great points coming up. So thanks for that, Jeff. Luis?
Yeah, great paper. Thanks for the presentation. I am also very curious about the mechanisms underlying the effect of purchasing homes, like the effects on minority households, and why are they going exactly there? And so it would be interesting to see if it's precisely the story that you're telling, which is, gentrifying neighborhoods and seeing whether the presence of investors actually either triggers or follows gentrification. I cannot think about how to identify this causally, but at least a timeline of events would be interesting in seeing whether, people with higher education and younger people had already begun moving to this neighborhood when the investors moved in, or vice versa. And I wonder if this is also, it would be interesting to see how this affects the transformation of the neighborhood, including the demographic, right? So a little bit more information, and maybe this is another paper on changes in race, but also changes, if it's this gentrification, maybe there's a change in age composition as well. And I don't know if, I'm trying to think of younger people moving in and making a having a party, and then people complaining about noise, and whether this is what's going on besides actual, like, more serious crime. I know you mentioned like property crime and drug crime, but maybe if they're all in the same category, maybe it's a party that, went crazy. I don't know. Maybe it's associated with changes in demographics in terms of age. That would be
No,
awesome.
1,000%. I think that's kind of that last point in the conclusion is, I think once we have a better sense of the renters that are moving in, we can speak more confidently about that. But I will say that those crime statistics are like from the Charlotte Police Department. This is not that a property crime would be exactly as it's defined by the FBI, violent crime exactly like drug crime. The nuisance code violations are the things like trash on the lawn, tall grass, etc. But fair point. I agree, and I think there's a lot to be done with the demographics. No, that's great. Awesome. Steve, how are your fingers? I see 70 comments in the chat.
These guys are working me hard. I appreciate it. I think I answered most of the questions.
Okay, cool. So what do you, I think we're just about time. Luis, Lindsay, does this sound?
Yeah, this was wonderful. Really great discussion and wonderful paper. Thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully we will see you at our next seminar. Thanks so much.
I really appreciate it. Thanks. Luis and Lindsay, does the stuff in the chat get recorded and saved, or do you know how that works?
Yeah, I think